The reason for that is because we're really committed that for some of us, turning our Christmases upside down may just be the most freeing, wonderful thing that we've ever done. And do we have kids today, or they're staying with us, right? Staying here. All right. I found something this year that I think is pretty unique to our church. As we've gone through the years, the Littlefields have looked for different ways to trim our budget, to capture some additional time. And one of the choices we made about a year and a half ago was to ditch cable. It wasn't so much philosophical. It was, that's a big chunk. We're not really using it. We can probably do other things. And we all agreed, all right, adios. I don't miss cable except for this season of football. That's a really difficult one for me to say no more. But what I found this year is it's really hard to find friends who have cable that I can go over and watch football, because a lot of people tend to be ditching it. And so I find myself out at restaurants and bars with friends watching some football, and it's been a great thing. But the idea of ditching cable sounds so pure, doesn't it? Like all of a sudden that distraction is gone. But the Littlefield family, we have Netflix. And this is how this rolls. Ditching cable feels really freeing. All of a sudden there's not that distraction. But with Netflix, you can binge watch. How many of you have ever watched more than 3 shows in a row on Netflix? All right. So you're binge watching with me. There are some shows that literally you can get sucked in and spend hours and hours just watching because it's right there. And so I found while cable was limiting, I mean, you only had your one show at a certain time, Netflix opens it wide open. I say that not because I particularly care about your TV watching habits, but I know in my life, sometimes a little bit seems insufficient. More seems good, but if I can get even more, the most, that seems really satisfying to me. Because we live in a culture where more is always better. More options, more time, more anything. Our Thanksgiving was nuts this year. We enjoyed time with family, but when we came to the dessert table, I am not exaggerating. There had to be a dozen options for us. I think like 8 pies, 2 cakes, and then some other option sitting there. And we loved it because it's good to have more. And then we eat so much turkey that we say we're never going to have any more. Until we raid the fridge for our late night turkey sandwich, and we complain that there's no more gravy. Because more, just a little more, always seems good. Don't you find that in your life? Do you ever have that mindset of just a little more, be it video games or being on Facebook or even reading books? For some people, exercising. And so many of us, when we approach this holiday, when Advent comes, we spend money just a little more on things that don't satisfy, won't satisfy. And then when January comes, we open up the bill and we feel that regret. Have you ever been there? And then you wonder why. The answer is because you live in a culture that says just a little more. A little more will always be better. I've spent time at some of your workplaces. I've spent time at some of your homes. There are things that you do that I have no idea how you do it so well. I am not a health coach. I'm not an occupational coach. But what God has given me as your pastor is to invite you to do something with me. To say, maybe this year, can be a little bit different. Maybe this year, I'm willing to conspire to tap your inner rebel and to throw off some of the shackles that have come on, to find the better way to live and approach Christmas. I've had questions about the whole idea of conspiracy, that it's an odd word to use, that it's a marketing ploy, which on some levels, yes and yes. But I want to invite you to look with me this morning. The idea of a conspiracy is not something that we've come up with in 2014. Conspiracy is just people gathering together to plan, overthrow powers that be. And what does all this have to do with Christmas? Turn to Luke chapter 2 with me. Because there's an incredible, subversive, rebellious story that comes out at Christmas. Luke chapter 2. And I hope, for those of you who read this passage on Christmas morning, I hope this gives you a new perspective, hopefully a little more real perspective, because we turn to this to find comfort, to wrap ourselves in our warm blankies, to feel good, to hit the traditions with our family. And I don't think that was God's original intention in here. Somehow I think when we view this story as comfortable, we miss the whole scene. It's a dangerous story written in dangerous times. It begins in verse 1 with rebellion in the air. In those days, Caesar Augustus issued a decree that a census should be taken of the entire Roman world. The Son of God is about to be born. These words are very familiar to you. But have you ever asked, why did God choose to speak about a governmental official as the introduction to the birth of his Son? It's a little weird, isn't it? It's a little strange. It's almost like the writer of Scriptures, Luke, through the inspiration of the Holy Spirit, said, there are powers out here, but there's one coming who will overthrow. These days of Caesar Augustus are the days that Jesus is born into. We're not totally sure when Jesus was born. We're pretty sure that it wasn't some cataclysmic calendar change, to go from BC to AD. There's no flipper ready to say, all right, right now it's a little masked, it's a little blurred. Maybe it was 6 BC, 5 BC, 4. We're not sure, but we do know it's the time of the Caesars. The Roman Empire at this time goes from England to the Persian Gulf. And if you lived in the Roman Empire, I guarantee you, you would not spend a second asking who's in charge. You knew. Caesar. Caesar's in charge. He's the king. He's got the power. The world is under their control. They're in charge. There are a lot of bloody fights in history for control of this empire. Just about 2 decades before Jesus came, young Octavius emerges. He becomes Caesar. He changes his name to Augustus, which means deity, majesty. And Augustus is now the man in charge. There's peace over the empire. And most are grateful after all this unrest. The territories that are pleased that Caesar is in charge, but not all. Most are grateful, but not all. They're entering the golden age. There's universal peace and happiness. And right here, right at this moment, something slips into the scene. It's going to change everything. It's now that something creeps into the religion and culture of their day. If you were a Roman citizen, you would have been required to at least acknowledge publicly that I will worship what they called the religio. It's the state religion. It's the mythology around it. It's declaring that Caesar's Lord and Caesar is worthy of worship. You didn't have to believe it, but you had to do it. You couldn't walk out of your house and not subscribe to the religio. everyone was expected to do so. And not everyone believed in the Greek gods and goddesses, but they all continued to participate in it because it was non-negotiable. You didn't mess with it. It's not something you ever questioned. But there's also another level. We hear a lot of this in our day, too. That we have a private life and a public life, right? You've heard that dialogue. I believe, but it just affects my private life. It doesn't need to affect my public life. And the Romans had the same thing. You participate in the religio, you can do whatever you want in your own home. The superstitio, they called it. You see, what you believed in your own home didn't matter. There's no threat to the empire. You can do whatever you want. It's only when you came out of your house into the state worship that if you challenged that, then you'd come into trouble. So you were able to believe, to do whatever you wanted to at home, but publicly you had to participate in the religio. Julius Caesar, just before Caesar Augustus had been declared divine. And this is an astounding thing, that Jesus is born into this. The dad is declared divine. Julius Caesar. Caesar Augustus, his son then, becomes the son of a god. And there was no mistaking that this is the message that was sent out. Julius was the adopted father, the forerunner of Augustus. Therefore, the conclusion is Augustus is the Son of God. In fact, coins were stamped with words like this: salvation should be found in no one other than Augustus. Other coins said there's no other name given among men whereby they can be saved. Can you hear it? Can you hear the rebellion in the air? Because this is going to be on a collision course with another group that believed a crucified rabbi who was said to be resurrected was the King of Kings. This movement said they believed, based on his resurrection, that this rabbi was the King of Kings, the Lord of Lords. And Peter, one of the leaders of this movement, he said in Acts chapter 4, "And there is salvation in no one else, for there is no other name under heaven given among men by which we must be saved." And Peter knew exactly what he was speaking, because the rebellion had started. This was the makings of a conspiracy, the fodder for a rebellion. This was the stuff that people in the future were going to be killed and crucified for. The problem for the early Christ followers, the superstitio, isn't that they believed in Jesus. It was that they took that out of their homes and said that Julius is not king and Augustus is not king, that this crucified rabbi, Jesus, is king. Francis Schaeffer said, "You weren't killed in those days because you worshiped Jesus Christ. Christians were killed because they were rebels. Their acts were considered as treason. They were considered rebels. If you are a follower of Jesus today, you come from a long line of rebels. You come from a long line of people who have said, no more. There is another." Luke 2 goes on. What Caesar issues always happens. Verse 2. This was the first census that took place while Quirinius was governor of Syria, and everyone went to his own town to register. And so Joseph takes Mary, and they go to Bethlehem. Bethlehem, I know we picture it real nice up here. It's this nothing town on the outskirts of Jerusalem. It's about 20 miles out of town. No one drove there to go to work. Everyone left there to go to work. Bethlehem is the place that the lawn has grown up. The cars are all covered. It's hard to count how many are in the yard at this point. NASCAR is the only thing on the big screen TV in the mobile home in Bethlehem. It's a nothing town that has no notoriety to it, other than God had said, this no-name town, Bethlehem, there's a king coming. And he's coming from Bethlehem. In fact, it sounds like this from Micah. But you, O Bethlehem Ephrathah, who are too little to be among the clans of Judah, from you shall come forth for me one, who is to be ruler in Israel, whose coming forth is from of old, from ancient days. And God is saying, my Messiah, my answer to the problem, will enter this situation, and he will be born in Bethlehem. And this is great news for almost everyone. Matthew chapter 2 is another introduction to the birth narrative. After Jesus was born in Bethlehem, this is the words we find. Now, after Jesus was born in Bethlehem of Judea in the days of Herod the king, behold, wise men from the east came to Jerusalem, saying, where is he who has been born King of the Jews? And how many kings can be in a kingdom? One. Exactly one. You can never have a kingdom with more than one king. It just will not ever work, and Herod knows this. And he hears the request coming, where is the one born King of the Jews? And we know how Herod, because it's how any king would react. It's time, it's on. I'm out. I'm out for him. There's two kings. Herod the Great was one of the nastiest characters in all of history. If you've watched any of the Bible movies you've seen, he's the guy that trusts nobody. He has 10 wives. He only loves one of them. And he eventually ends up killing all of them. He eliminates 2 of his sons because he thought maybe they're a threat to my kingdom. And so he murders them. And then the wise men come asking, where's the king? It's needless to say Herod wasn't happy. He's paranoid already. When he's asked about King of the Jews, he asks around, and the experts tell him, God said Bethlehem, that there's a king being born in Bethlehem. And the story goes on, and it's not a nice, peaceful, fuzzy story, is it? Herod goes to Bethlehem, and he slaughters all the baby boys 2 years old and under. But we don't read that as part of our Christmas story because we like our Christmases to be warm and fuzzy and just make me feel good. But the fact is, Jesus came as a rebel to the system, to the religio, to say, there is no king other than me. And all the powers of the world push against and rail against that message. And over time, this little baby, God in the flesh, began to change things. Hearts are changed. Life is turned upside down or right side up. And it happened without threats. There was no force. But it came through the transformation of what Philip Yancey called a revolution of grace. So what does all this mean for us this Christmas? In your personal world, would you say that there are Caesars demanding your worship, demanding your money, demanding your time, demanding your affection? I wonder what they are. Because what they tell us is, if we only do this, if we only buy this, if we only get this, if we only have a little bit more of this, we'll be satisfied. You'll be content. And then we can celebrate Christmas well. And I know everyone sitting here would say that we don't really think happiness comes from spending a lot at Christmas. But look at your debt. Does it say the same thing? We justify spending a lot for all sorts of reasons. Most of them make no sense. At the end of the day, we just want to spend a little bit more and give a little bit more. I think this is the religio of our day. That if we just support the local economy, support local business, spend a little more, go to the sales, buy this gift, one day only, on and on and on. You live in a world that is giving you one message. Spend more money. Give us your money. Earn more money so you can give it to us. That is the message that comes to us all the time. I want to encourage you. The kingdom of just one more thing will not ever satisfy. As your pastor, I want to urge you, invite you, to tap into that inner rebel that God has placed in you. To say, I don't need to do the same thing when I step out the door. That God has given me a different option. And what it can look like, it doesn't have to, but what it can look like is for you and your family to say, we're going to make a different decision this year. And this is what it's going to look like. We're going to spend a little bit less so that we can give a little bit more. And I need to clarify some things. I've had conversations with some of you. Please note, I am not saying don't spend any money at Christmas. Nothing has ever particularly happened to me that I hate Christmas. I'm not a Scrooge, as far as I know. Our family has some great traditions that we love. I am not saying abandon everything. Some of you may have gotten that message that if I spend any money at Christmas, somehow I'm doing something bad. If I've given you that message, I apologize and I need your forgiveness. Giving gifts taps right into that original story. It really does. I'm just asking you, would you ponder stepping out your door and asking about the culture we live in? Having the conversation with your family, is there something different that would capture the spirit of our family better than what we're doing? Somehow, I think this is probably the most misunderstood point of the 4 weeks of Advent conspiracy. The only question we're asking us to ponder, how much is too much or not enough? And that is going to vary family to family. And so one of the things we refuse to do is to set a mark or to look at others who say, I'm going to choose something differently. God forbid we end up being in a place where we judge one another and criticize one another because I found this way that's worked for my family and you need to come over here too. That is not the spirit that we're trying to put out there. The spirit is just this. Jesus came to overthrow the systems of his day. Is there anything that our families can do to share in that same rebellion? To say, I don't have to go down a certain path. With my kids and with my spouse, is there something that we can do differently that would honor God? That's all. And we're giving you some options, if you choose to follow this path, to incredibly bless our community and to incredibly bless a young couple in Brazil sharing the gospel. And we're asking you, potentially, if you're willing, to give your time on Christmas Eve to bring some people into your homes, to share time, to share relationships, to share a meal with them prior to our time here at church. Have you had an honest conversation with your family about this? Maybe just asking, what do we expect from our stuff? If I were to press you, you could probably remember one or two really special gifts from last year, right? But when you get down into number 3 and 4 and 5, it's really hard to remember what those were. I wonder if we even have whatever those were anymore. And 2 years ago, could you even remember the special gift you were given? We're just asking, would you spend some time pondering whether or not spending a little less this Christmas would be a blessing for you and for others? Because somehow, when we live life believing that if a little is good, more is better, and a lot is the very best, then you will always live with regret, chasing after just a little more, because the best will always be just out of reach. To avoid this, I encourage you, rebel a little bit. Tap in to what God has given you. To say, God is a giver who gives us Jesus. And as one of Jesus' people, how can I be a giver? How can I be a giver to others who are in need on the fringes? For some of you, spending less is obvious, and you wonder, why do we just waste all this time? It's already a way of life. You wonder why it even needs to be taught. That's okay. For some of us, though, perhaps it's something we need to ponder more. What if this Christmas meant we stood for something? That there's a better way as followers of Jesus to make a statement about the coming of the Son of God. That there'd be a more meaningful way. To say no to the things that don't really matter, but to say yes to the stuff that does matter. People and time and relationships and the gospel. I hope that when we leave here today after having some time in song, some time in prayer, that we could be committed together as a church, as a family, to living, laughing, giving, and being different than we've ever lived and laughed and enjoyed before. Because we finally tap in to the thing that God has always been asking, that His people would be givers. As we spend less, it will free us up, not just from anxiety and debt, but we'll be freed up to give more of our time and resources where they really matter. We'll spend time on this next week. Let me pray, and I always have to check our schedule during Advent for the Sunday mornings. Chris. Oh, there you are. Are we having the prayer time right after? Awesome. We got some good feedback from people. Some of you loved the interaction on the questions. Others of you were really nervous about having to talk to people. So if you see someone really frightened with their eyes frozen, be really kind to them. Don't press them too much. We're going to give you a chance in response to the sermon with your family or whoever's in your pew. We put 3 questions in your bulletin. To answer those, do we have a timer that's going to go again? All right. So I will verbally give a 1-minute cue and a 30-second cue. We're going to give you 2 minutes to work through this. And then we'll simply ask you, would you be willing to go to another pew, find someone you don't know as well, and share and just interact on some of these questions? So you have 2 minutes, and here we go.